This is a bedtime biography, not a lecture, not a lesson, just a quiet story about a man whose ideas never quite settled. His name was Charles Sanders Peirce. He lived in the 19th century, at a time when the world felt increasingly confident about itself. Science was advancing, measurement was improving, systems were being built to explain nature, society, and the mind with growing precision. There was a widespread sense that understanding was finally catching up with reality. Peirce was raised inside that confidence. He grew up surrounded by mathematics, logic, and scientific discipline. He was trained to measure carefully, to reason slowly, and to distrust easy answers. From an early age, he learned that intuition could mislead, and that certainty often arrived before it was earned. And yet, the more deeply he studied, the less satisfied he became. Peirce spent his life thinking about how we understand things, how ideas form, how meaning takes shape. He wasn't interested in opinions or beliefs. He wanted to know what actually happens when something becomes meaningful to us. What he noticed was unsettling. Explanations never truly finished. Conclusions worked for a time, then required correction. Understanding seemed to arrive gradually, through use and revision, rather than through revelation. Meaning, he realized, did not sit still. This was not a dramatic discovery. Peirce did not announce it loudly. He did not build a movement around it. He wrote quietly, constantly, often alone. He filled notebooks with careful reasoning, diagrams, and reflections that rarely found an audience while he was alive. His career never stabilized. Academic positions came and went. Financial security never arrived. Much of his work remained unpublished, unread, or misunderstood. By conventional standards, his life looked unfinished, but his ideas lingered. Long after his death, pieces of Peirce's thinking began to surface in places he could never have imagined. In the study of language, in probability and statistics, in media theory, in how machines learn to recognize patterns and generate meaning without understanding it. Again and again, people encountered the same problem Peirce had noticed. Meaning would not settle. He never claimed that truth didn't exist. What troubled him was something quieter. That truth takes time. That it emerges slowly through correction and disagreement, and that no individual ever gets to stop that process. This made him difficult to place, too rigorous for those who wanted certainty, too patient for those who wanted answers now, and yet his ideas never disappeared. They waited. Tonight, we're going to trace the life of Charles Sanders Peirce, not to turn him into a hero, not to simplify his thinking, but to understand why meaning itself began to feel unfinished in his wake. Before we continue, pause for a moment. You're listening to this at a specific hour, somewhere in the world, under conditions no one else shares in exactly the same way. I'd like to know where you're at. In the comments, tell me what time it is for you right now and where you're listening from. And if there's another figure, idea, or story you'd like this series to explore next, let me know that too. If you find value in these quiet biographies, you can support the work by liking the video and subscribing. It helps these stories continue, and it lets me know this pace and format are worth keeping. Now, let's begin. Charles Sanders Peirce was born into a world that believed it was finally learning how things worked. The 19th century was an age of confidence. Railroads stitched continents together. Telegraph wires carried messages faster than horses ever could. New instruments measured time, distance, and motion with increasing precision. Science promised not just discovery, but mastery. The prevailing mood was not curiosity. It was convergence. There was a sense that knowledge was approaching completion, that the remaining mysteries were technical problems, not fundamental ones. With enough data, enough discipline, enough method, the world could be explained, classified, and controlled. This confidence shaped everything. Universities expanded. Laboratories multiplied. Fields of study narrowed and specialized. The idea of the expert emerged, someone who knew enough to speak with authority, to close questions rather than open them. Uncertainty was treated as a temporary condition, ignorance as a flaw to be eliminated. Peirce entered this world not as an outsider, but as an insider. He was raised inside its optimism, trained in its methods, and fluent in its language. He did not reject science. He took it seriously. More seriously, perhaps, than most of his contemporaries. That seriousness is what made him uncomfortable. The more he watched science at work, the more he noticed something that clashed with the era's confidence. Discoveries rarely arrived cleanly. Experiments failed. Measurements conflicted. Theories required adjustment. What had been considered settled quietly reopened. Knowledge advanced, but not in straight lines. Each breakthrough depended on assumptions that could later be questioned. Each explanation worked only within certain limits. Progress, when examined closely, looked less like a march toward certainty and more like a sequence of corrections. This did not bother most people. The visible successes of science outweighed its internal instability. Machines worked. Bridges stood. Medicines improved. Results mattered more than philosophical discomfort. But Peirce paid attention to the discomfort. He noticed that certainty was often declared before it was earned, that conclusions were treated as endpoints when they were really pauses. That authority frequently stepped in where understanding remained incomplete. This gap between appearance and process fascinated him. The world looked certain because it functioned, but functioning was not the same as understanding. Systems could work while resting on provisional explanations. Agreement could form without truth having fully arrived. Peirce began to suspect that certainty was less a property of knowledge and more a psychological response to complexity. People needed conclusions in order to act. Institutions needed settled answers in order to govern. Science, despite its methods, was still practiced by humans who preferred closure to suspension. This preference shaped what counted as knowledge. Ideas that promised finality thrived. Ideas that insisted on ongoing revision struggled to find a home. The culture rewarded confidence, not hesitation. Authority grew where doubt was least visible. Peirce did not accuse the system of dishonesty. He understood why it existed. A society cannot function if everything remains open indefinitely. Decisions must be made, structures must hold. But he also understood the cost. When certainty becomes a goal rather than a byproduct, inquiry changes. Questions narrow. Anomalies are minimized. Disagreement becomes noise instead of signal. Truth. Under these conditions, risks being mistaken for consensus. Peirce lived at the height of this tension. He watched science succeed spectacularly while misunderstanding its own nature. He watched certainty harden around ideas still in motion. He watched confidence replace patience. To many, this was progress. To Peirce, it was a warning sign. Not because knowledge was failing, but because it was being misunderstood. Knowledge did not move toward rest. It moved through correction. Understanding did not arrive fully formed. It accumulated unevenly across time. The world looked certain because it needed to, but beneath that surface, meaning was already shifting. Peirce would spend his life exploring this instability, not to undermine science, but to explain how it actually worked. Not to reject certainty outright, but to understand why it kept arriving too early, before he became isolated, before his ideas began their long-delayed afterlife. There was first a world that believed certainty was within reach, and a man who quietly noticed that it never stayed there. Charles Sanders Peirce did not grow up surrounded by uncertainty. He grew up surrounded by precision. His father, Benjamin Peirce, was a respected mathematician and astronomer at Harvard. Numbers were not abstractions in their household. They were tools, instruments, ways of testing whether the world behaved as expected. Precision was not admired for its elegance, but for its discipline. From an early age, Charles was immersed in this environment. Mathematics was treated less as a subject and more as a habit of mind. Errors were not moral failures. They were signals, something to be examined, corrected, and understood. This mattered. Peirce learned early that confidence was not the same as accuracy. That intuition, however persuasive, could mislead. That the mind required constraints if it was to approach truth at all. His father encouraged rigor but not dogma. Young Charles was pushed to think carefully, not obediently. He was taught to work problems through method rather than rely on inherited answers. Precision came first. Comfort came later, or not at all. This training shaped Peirce's temperament. He was not drawn to authority. He was drawn to process. He trusted systems that could correct themselves over time more than individuals who claimed certainty in the moment. Where others sought answers, Peirce learned to examine assumptions. This did not make him skeptical in the casual sense. He did not doubt everything indiscriminately. He doubted carelessly held conclusions. He doubted certainty that arrived without method. He doubted explanations that could not explain their own limits. In this way, doubt was not destructive. It was preparatory. Peirce came to see thinking as an activity that unfolded slowly. Understanding emerged through repetition, revision, and comparison. A belief was not something adopted once and defended forever. It was something tested against experience and adjusted accordingly. This way of thinking set him apart. Most people prefer conclusions. They offer relief. A settled answer allows attention to move elsewhere. Peirce was trained to resist that relief. He was taught that stopping too early introduced error. Even as a child, he showed signs of this disposition. He was observant, inward, and methodical. He paid attention to how explanations were formed, not just whether they were convincing. He noticed inconsistencies others ignored. He lingered where others moved on. This did not always serve him well socially. Peirce could be difficult. He questioned premises that others accepted. He insisted on distinctions that felt unnecessary. He took ideas seriously long after they had become conventions. But this seriousness was learned, not innate. In his father's world, mathematics did not reward certainty. It rewarded correction. An equation that worked only under limited conditions was not wrong, but it was incomplete. A solution that could not be generalized remained provisional. This attitude extended beyond numbers. Peirce began to suspect that most human beliefs operated provisionally, whether people acknowledged it or not. Social norms, scientific theories, moral judgments, all functioned under assumptions that could later be revised. The problem, as he saw it, was not that beliefs changed. It was that people pretended they didn't. This pretense created tension. Institutions depended on stability. They required settled answers in order to operate. But inquiry, when pursued honestly, produced instability. It reopened questions that authority preferred to close. Peirce felt this tension early. He lived between a world that demanded conclusions and a method that resisted them. Unlike many thinkers who arrive at Tao through disappointment or crisis, Peirce arrived there through training. He was taught to distrust certainty before it failed him personally. This made his doubt quieter but deeper. He did not rage against belief. He examined it. He did not seek to replace certainty with chaos. He sought to understand why certainty appeared when it did and why it dissolved when examined closely. This orientation would shape everything that followed. It would guide his education. It would isolate him from institutions. It would leave much of his work unfinished in the public eye. But it would also prepare him to notice something others missed. That meaning itself behaved like an equation under revision. That understanding did not arrive fully formed. And that doubt, when Charles Sanders Peirce entered formal education, he did so already fluent in its language. He understood mathematics. He respected logic. He accepted the discipline of careful reasoning. On the surface, he looked like exactly the kind of mind institutions were built to cultivate. But education is not only about knowledge, it is also about alignment. Universities in the 19th century were becoming engines of order. They sorted ideas, established hierarchies, and rewarded conclusions that could be defended clearly and efficiently. Knowledge was expected to move toward stability. Questions were welcomed, but only insofar as they could be resolved. Peirce did not resist this openly, at least not at first. He studied chemistry at Harvard. He immersed himself in logic, mathematics, and philosophy. He read Kant carefully. He engaged deeply with German idealism. He absorbed the tools that serious inquiry required. But as his education progressed, a subtle problem emerged. Peirce did not treat philosophical systems as shelters. He treated them as instruments. He wanted to know not just what a theory claimed, but how it behaved when stressed, where it broke down, what assumptions it relied on without admitting. This was not how institutions expected students to engage. Most systems were taught as structures to inhabit. Peirce treated them as hypotheses to test. He was less interested in defending positions than in examining how they functioned over time. This created friction. Philosophy departments valued coherence. Peirce valued corrigibility. Logic courses emphasized proof. Peirce focused on inference. Science instruction favored repeatability. Peirce noticed how novelty entered despite it. He began to feel that education was offering him answers when he was still studying the question itself. This made him difficult to place. He was not a rebel. He did not reject tradition. He simply refused to treat inherited frameworks as finished. Where others sought shelter in established systems, Peirce stood outside them, examining their foundations. Education for him did not provide a home. It provided exposure. He learned how ideas were stabilized, not because they were complete, but because stability was useful. He saw how certainty was cultivated, rewarded, and protected. He noticed that disagreement was tolerated only up to the point where it threatened coherence. Peirce's mind did not move comfortably within these boundaries. He was interested in how beliefs formed before they hardened, how explanations emerged before they were formalized, how meaning shifted as it passed from one context to another. These questions did not fit neatly into curricula. As a result, Peirce's education did not culminate in intellectual shelter. It left him more exposed than before. He possessed tools without a system willing to house them fully. This exposure followed him into his early professional life. He worked as a scientist for the United States Coast Survey, engaging in precise measurement and empirical research. Once again, he found himself inside institutions that prized accuracy but preferred conclusions to remain settled. Here, too, he noticed instability. Measurements varied. Instruments drifted. Observations required interpretation. Even the most careful data depended on assumptions about method, context, and correction. The more exact the work became, the more visible its provisional nature grew. This reinforced what Peirce had already begun to suspect. Education had taught him how to think, but not how to belong. He had learned the disciplines of inquiry without acquiring the protections of institutional certainty. He understood systems deeply enough to see their limits, but not superficially enough to accept them as complete. This left him in an uncomfortable position. He was too rigorous to ignore instability, too patient to declare final answers, too precise to simplify. Education had sharpened his mind, but offered him no shelter. And so Peirce carried forward with a growing awareness that serious inquiry did not converge toward rest. It remained open, corrective, and unfinished. This awareness would soon crystallize into something more than discomfort. It would become a discovery that reshaped how he understood meaning itself. And once that discovery took hold, there would be no institution capable of holding him fully again. Peirce did not arrive at his central insight through revelation or rebellion. It emerged gradually, as the quiet consequence of habits he had already formed. The more carefully he examined how people thought, reasoned, and understood one another, the more he noticed a problem no system seemed willing to confront. Meaning did not behave like an object. It did not remain where it was placed. It shifted as it moved. A word spoken in one context behaved differently in another. An explanation that satisfied one audience failed entirely for another. Understanding seemed less like a thing transferred intact and more like a process that unfolded unevenly over time. This observation unsettled Peirce because it resisted stabilization. Philosophy had long treated meaning as something that could be defined. Science treated it as something that could be measured. Institutions treated it as something that could be fixed through authority. Peirce began to see that all three relied on an assumption that did not hold. Meaning did not settle. It formed through interpretation, and interpretation never stopped. Peirce realized that whenever a sign was used to point toward something else, it entered a chain. A mark on a page suggested an idea. That idea invoked another association. That association depended on prior experience, expectation, and habit. Understanding emerged not at the sign itself, but somewhere downstream, after movement had already occurred. This movement was not a flaw. It was the mechanism. Meaning required translation. Translation required context. If meaning depended on interpretation, then it could not be locked into definitions permanently. If it required interpretation, then disagreement was not a failure of understanding, but evidence that understanding was still underway. Peirce did not find this liberating. He found it dangerous. Institutions relied on fixed meaning. Law required definitions. Science required operational clarity. Social order depended on shared interpretations that did not drift too far apart. A world in which meaning moved threatened coordination itself. Yet denying the movement did not stop it. Peirce began to understand that people compensated for this instability by pretending meaning was more stable than it was. They treated conventions as necessities. They enforced interpretations through authority. They punished deviation not because it was wrong, but because it exposed fragility. Meaning was being managed, not understood. This realization marked a turning point. Peirce no longer asked how meaning should be defined. He asked how it functioned under pressure, how it behaved when context changed, how it survived misunderstanding, misuse, and disagreement. He noticed that interpretation always involved anticipation. A reader guessed at intent before confirmation. A listener formed expectations before clarification. Understanding began with a hypothesis, not a conclusion. This meant that error was not an interruption of meaning. It was its entry point. Meaning advanced by correction. A misunderstanding provoked adjustment. A failed interpretation refined expectation. Over time, shared habits emerged, not because they were final, but because they worked well enough to continue. The unsettling implication was unavoidable. No individual controlled meaning. Intention mattered, but it did not govern outcome. Authority could enforce usage, but not comprehension. Stability was always provisional. Peirce understood that this insight could not be popularized easily. A culture that depended on certainty would resist it. Systems built on closure would treat it as corrosive. Even philosophers, trained to question assumptions, preferred foundations that could be defended. Peirce offered none. He described meaning as something alive, responsive, and unfinished. It adapted as it moved. It accumulated history. It carried the residue of prior interpretations within it. This made understanding historical by nature. To know what something meant now required knowing how it had been used before. Meaning became a record of interaction rather than a container of essence. Peirce did not celebrate this condition. He accepted it. He understood that trying to freeze meaning would break it. That insisting on final definitions would produce brittle systems unable to adapt. That stability achieved through denial would eventually collapse under strain. This was not a theory meant to comfort. It was a diagnosis. Once seen, it could not be unseen. Meaning could not return to rest. Interpretation could not be stopped. Understanding would continue to move, whether acknowledged or not. This was the discovery that would not settle, and it ensured that nothing built upon meaning ever fully would. Peirce recognized that this movement did not destroy communication. It made it possible. Shared meaning emerged not from certainty, but from patience, not from agreement, but from sustained correction. The cost was discomfort. The reward was continuity. Meaning endured because it changed, and changed because it endured. 5. When meaning escaped the author. As Charles Sanders Peirce continued refining his ideas, one consequence became impossible to ignore. Meaning did not remain attached to its point of origin. Once expressed, it moved independently of intention. An author could propose, a speaker could suggest, but understanding unfolded elsewhere. Meaning escaped the author. This was not a metaphor. It was an observable process. A written statement left the page and entered a world of readers who brought with them habits, histories, expectations, and fears. Each encounter altered how the statement functioned. No explanation could travel unchanged. Peirce began to see communication as an interaction rather than a transmission. A sign did not carry meaning the way a container carries contents. It triggered interpretation. An interpretation depended on what the reader already knew, what they anticipated, and what they were prepared to accept. This made understanding participatory. A reader did not receive meaning. A reader completed it. This realization reframed everything. If meaning emerged only through interpretation, then it could never be fully controlled by its creator. Intention mattered, but it did not govern outcome. The same sentence could reassure one reader and alarm another. Both interpretations could be coherent within their contexts. This instability was not accidental. It was structural. Peirce understood that signs behaved differently depending on how they related to what they pointed toward. Some resembled their objects. Some were connected through direct association. Others relied entirely on convention and agreement. Readers constantly moved between these modes, often without noticing. Under calm conditions, this movement caused little trouble. Under pressure, it became volatile. People treated resemblance as evidence. They mistook correlation for causation. They treated conventions as necessities. Meaning hardened prematurely when fear demanded closure. Peirce recognized that this was not a failure of intelligence. It was a feature of how interpretation worked under constraint. Meaning did not simply drift. It responded. When uncertainty intensified, interpretation accelerated. Readers filled gaps quickly. They favored coherence over accuracy. They selected interpretations that stabilized anxiety, even if those interpretations rested on fragile assumptions. The author could not prevent this. Once released, a sign belonged to circulation. This had profound implications. Authority could regulate usage, but not understanding. Education could train interpretation, but not complete it. Even the most careful explanation would eventually encounter contexts it could not anticipate, meaning accumulated history. Each interpretation left residue. Each use shaped future expectation. Over time, signs carried the weight of prior misunderstandings alongside clarifications. Meaning became layered, not fixed. Peirce began to see this layering everywhere. Scientific terms shifted as theories evolved. Legal language adapted as precedents accumulated. Ordinary words changed as social habits transformed. Meaning never returned to an original state. It moved forward, carrying traces of where it had been. This made stability fragile. Shared understanding existed, but only provisionally. It depended on ongoing correction, not permanent agreement. Communication worked because participants adjusted continually, not because meaning stayed put. Peirce realized that many institutions misunderstood this process. They treated meaning as something that could be secured through definition. They assumed that clarity could be achieved once and maintained indefinitely. When interpretation diverged, they blamed error or bad faith. What they were resisting was not misunderstanding. It was motion. Meaning refused to obey containment. The more tightly it was constrained, the more brittle it became. Systems that depended on rigid interpretation fractured under novelty. Those that allowed adjustment endured. This insight deepened Peirce's concern. A society that demanded certainty would misread how meaning functioned. It would confuse enforcement with understanding. It would mistake repetition for stability. Over time, this confusion would accumulate tension. Peirce did not propose a solution in the traditional sense. He did not offer rules that could stop drift. He did not promise clarity without cost. He described a condition that had to be lived with. Meaning escaped the author because it had to. If it did not, communication would collapse. New context would become unintelligible. Growth would stall. Understanding would harden into dogma, meaning survive by moving. The unsettling conclusion followed naturally. Interpretation was not an optional layer added after meaning. It was the mechanism by which meaning existed at all. Once this was understood, authorship changed. Writing was no longer an act of control. It was an invitation to participation, a proposal offered to future interpretation rather than a message sealed in advance. Peirce accepted this condition. He understood that meaning could not be owned, only tended. That stability emerged not from fixation, but from patience. That communication endured because it allowed itself to be corrected. Meaning had escaped its origin, and in doing so, it had revealed its true structure. As Charles Sanders Peirce watched how meaning moved, he began to notice another pattern that disturbed him even more. Interpretation did not wait for certainty. It moved ahead of it. People rarely began with evidence. They began with a guess. Faced with incomplete information, the mind leapt forward, proposing an explanation before proof arrived. Only later did confirmation or correction follow. Peirce recognized this as a distinct mode of thought. It was neither deduction, which applied rules, nor induction, which generalized from data. It was something quieter and riskier. A tentative leap that allowed understanding to begin at all. Without this leap, inquiry would never start. He saw it everywhere. A doctor formed a diagnosis before tests were complete. A scientist proposed a hypothesis before measurements confirmed it. An ordinary person interpreted a look, a pause, a tone, long before intentions were clarified. This process was not irrational. It was necessary. Understanding could not wait for certainty, because certainty arrived too late to guide action. The mind filled gaps quickly, constructing provisional stories that made experience manageable. Peirce noticed what happened next. Once events unfolded, people returned to their initial guesses and adjusted them. If the outcome aligned, confidence increased. If it diverged, the explanation was revised, meaning moved backward as well as forward. Interpretation was retroactive. This backward movement created the illusion of foresight. After events occurred, earlier guesses appeared prophetic. The mind rewrote its own uncertainty, remembering hesitation as insight. Peirce understood how dangerous this illusion could become. Under conditions of fear, the leap happened faster. Anxiety shortened patience. Explanations hardened before evidence could challenge them. Once fixed, they resisted correction. Fear demanded coherence more than accuracy. Peirce saw that crises intensified this tendency. When stability fractured, people searched desperately for patterns. They wanted to believe that events followed a script. That disaster was not arbitrary. In these moments, interpretation rushed ahead of reality. People selected explanations that reduced unease, even if those explanations rested on thin support. Coincidence was treated as signal. Resemblance was treated as proof. Narratives solidified quickly because uncertainty felt intolerable. Peirce did not condemn this response. He understood it. The leap was how humans navigated an unpredictable world. But when left unchecked, it produced certainty without grounding. Stories hardened into convictions. Convictions became shields against doubt. Once established, these interpretations rewrote memory. Past events were reorganized to fit the narrative. Ambiguity disappeared. What had been unclear now seemed obvious. This was not deception. It was cognition under pressure. Peirce realized that meaning often appeared most stable after events had passed. Looking backward, sequences felt inevitable. Causes aligned neatly. Outcomes seemed predictable. Looking forward, nothing felt so clear. This asymmetry shaped how people related to time. The past felt coherent. The future felt threatening. Interpretation worked to close that gap by projecting order backward. In this way, understanding moved in reverse. The danger arose when this reverse clarity was mistaken for foresight. When people believed their explanations had anticipated events rather than adjusted to them. When narratives were treated as predictions instead of reconstructions. Peirce saw how easily this confusion spread. Once an interpretation felt confirmed, it gained authority. Others adopted it. Repetition strengthened belief. Doubt was reframed as denial, meaning stabilized temporarily, but at a cost. Correction slowed. Alternative explanations were dismissed. Inquiry narrowed. What began as a useful leap became a rigid conclusion. Peirce believed this mechanism explained why false certainties survived so well. They did not need to predict accurately. They needed only to accommodate events after the fact, meaning survived by adaptation, not truth. This realization reinforced his conviction that understanding required humility. The leap was unavoidable, but it had to remain tentative. Hypotheses had to stay open to revision. Interpretation had to accept its own vulnerability. When fear removed that vulnerability, meaning became brittle, Peirce did not offer a cure for this tendency. He offered awareness. He wanted inquiry to acknowledge its starting point in uncertainty, to remember that explanations began as guesses, to resist the comfort of retroactive certainty, meaning move forward through hypotheses and backward through correction. Only by holding both directions together could understanding remain alive. This movement explained why certainty felt strongest after collapse and weakest before it. It explained why people trusted stories more than probabilities. It explained why meaning felt convincing precisely when it was most fragile. Peirce understood that reading the world backward was inevitable. The danger lay in forgetting that it was happening. Awareness did not eliminate the leap, but it slowed it. It reminded inquiry to remain provisional, to treat confidence as temporary, and to welcome correction rather than resist it. Peirce believed this posture was the only defense against narratives that fed on fear. Without it, interpretation hardened into doctrine, and doctrine closed itself to learning. With it, meaning could continue moving without collapsing. The leap remained, but it no longer pretended to be final. This humility preserved inquiry across time, allowing understanding to survive disagreement without demanding resolution, certainty, or rest. It accepted motion as the price of knowing. Nothing meaningful stayed still forever, and never truly could. By the time Charles Sanders Peirce reached the middle of his life, it had become clear that he would never belong comfortably inside an institution. This was not because he lacked intelligence, productivity, or originality. It was because the kind of thinking he practiced resisted the stability institutions required in order to function. Peirce worked for many years at the United States Coast Survey, an organization devoted to precision, measurement, and methodological rigor. In principle, the work suited him. It demanded patience, accuracy, and respect for error. He contributed meaningfully, improving methods of calibration and advancing standards of scientific measurement. But even there, friction emerged. Institutions valued conclusions that could be summarized cleanly. Peirce insisted on recording uncertainty. Where administrators wanted closure, he emphasized conditions. Where reports were expected to settle questions, his writing reopened them. His explanations grew longer rather than shorter. His conclusions remained provisional. What Peirce offered was intellectual honesty. What institutions demanded was finality. Over time, this mismatch became impossible to ignore. Peirce's personal circumstances made accommodation even more difficult. He struggled with health, finances, and routine. He was often late, frequently disorganized, and indifferent to appearances. He did not cultivate patrons easily. He did not soften his positions for strategic advantage. He treated ideas as obligations rather than tools. Institutions noticed. Academic appointments appeared briefly and disappeared without explanation. Teaching positions dissolved quietly. Recommendations failed to materialize. Peirce was not expelled dramatically. He was simply not retained. His name stopped circulating. Doors closed without confrontation. This erosion was gradual, but unmistakable. Peirce did not reject institutions outright. He wanted support, stability, and recognition. But he could not present his thinking as finished doctrine. His ideas remained in motion. He revised constantly. Confirmed conclusions were treated as temporary pauses rather than endpoints. To administrators, this appeared unreliable. Without stable employment, Peirce turned inward. Writing intensified. Manuscripts accumulated faster than they could be organized. Concepts were refined, reconsidered, and rewritten. Problems were approached repeatedly from different angles. Closure was deferred again and again. Much of this work remained unpublished. Peirce did not stop writing because he was discouraged. He stopped submitting because he believed premature publication hardened ideas before they were ready. Circulation, he feared, turned inquiry into assertion. Assertion invited defense. Defense killed learning. This belief carried consequences. Without institutional backing, his work circulated unevenly. Portions appeared in journals. Concepts were adopted without attribution. Ideas entered discourse detached from their origin. Influence spread quietly while the author receded. Peirce observed this with unease. He did not expect perfect understanding. He accepted misinterpretation as inevitable. Meaning, after all, depended on interpretation. What troubled him was the loss of process. Ideas stripped of their conditions became rigid. Methods became slogans. Inquiry froze. He felt responsible but powerless. Institutions could not house him because he would not stop revising. They could not rely on him because he refused to claim final authority. His intellectual integrity made him professionally untenable. Financial strain worsened. Health declined. Living conditions deteriorated. Peirce continued writing under increasingly difficult circumstances, driven not by hope of recognition, but by obligation to the work itself. Inquiry did not cease when conditions worsened. It intensified. There were no disciples forming around him. No movement carried his name. No moment of vindication arrived. His isolation was quiet, persistent, and exhausting. This absence of institutional shelter shaped his legacy. Peirce became a thinker whose ideas exceeded the structures meant to contain them. He articulated a philosophy that required patience, revision, and tolerance for uncertainty, looking like instability to systems built on certainty. In environments that rewarded answers, he preserved questions. In systems demanding closure, he maintained openness. The cost was exclusion. Peirce did not fail because his ideas lacked value. He failed because institutions could not accommodate a thinker who refused to stop the process of thinking. He became, by necessity, a thinker without an institution. And in that isolation, his ideas survived intact. Charles Sanders Peirce did not lose control of his ideas all at once. He watched them drift away slowly, carried outward by people who admired him, misunderstood him, and simplified him. No moment symbolized this drift more clearly than his relationship with William James. James was not an enemy. He was a friend. They shared intellectual roots, corresponded regularly, and influenced one another deeply. James admired Peirce's rigor and originality. He introduced Peirce's ideas to wider audiences. Without James, much of Peirce's thinking might have disappeared entirely. And yet, this assistance came at a cost. Peirce had developed pragmatism as a method, not a worldview. It was a way of clarifying meaning by tracing consequences. Concepts were to be tested through their practical implications, not affirmed as doctrines. The method emphasized discipline, restraint, and logical precision. James transformed this method into something more accessible. In James's hands, pragmatism became warmer, looser, and more psychological. Truth was framed less as a long-term convergence and more as what worked for individuals. Meaning shifted from communal inquiry to personal usefulness. The audience expanded. The rigor thinned. Peirce noticed immediately. What troubled him was not popularity. It was distortion. Pragmatism, as Peirce understood it, demanded patience and submission to future correction. James's version appeared to license belief according to comfort and effect. What Peirce treated as provisional, James treated as affirmative. The difference was subtle but decisive. Peirce worried that pragmatism was becoming permissive, that it was losing its logical spine. That meaning was being loosened until it could justify almost anything. He watched as the method he designed to restrain belief began enabling it. This felt like betrayal, even though it was not intended as one. James believed he was honoring Peirce by extending his ideas into lived experience. He saw pragmatism as a bridge between philosophy and life. Peirce saw that bridge turning into an exit. Their disagreement was rarely public. It unfolded in letters, revisions, and redefinitions. Peirce responded by renaming his own position, pragmaticism. Deliberately choosing a term, he said, ugly enough to be safe from kidnappers. The joke carried weight. Peirce was trying to protect the method by making it difficult to popularize. He wanted to slow interpretation. James wanted to widen it. One emphasized discipline. The other emphasized accessibility. This was the quiet rivalry. James succeeded socially. His lectures filled halls. His books sold widely. Pragmatism entered public discourse through his voice. Peirce, meanwhile, retreated further into technical writing and unpublished manuscripts. The split hardened. Peirce came to see James's pragmatism as a dilution. James came to see Peirce's objections as unnecessary severity. Both believed they were preserving the heart of the idea. History favored the version that traveled easily. As pragmatism spread, Peirce's influence became indirect. His ideas circulated under altered names and softened definitions. Students encountered pragmatism without encountering Peirce. The method survived, but its discipline faded. This deepened Peirce's isolation. He did not campaign to reclaim authority. He did not denounce James publicly. He refined his work privately, convinced that rigor mattered more than reach. If an idea survived, it should survive intact. What this rivalry revealed was not a clash of personalities, but a tension within philosophy itself. Ideas can endure by becoming flexible, or they can endure by remaining strict. James chose flexibility. Peirce chose rigor. The public rewarded the former. History quietly preserved the latter. Peirce understood, perhaps better than anyone, that meaning changes once it leaves its origin. He had written extensively about interpretation, drift, and mediation. Now he was watching it happen to his own work. The rivalry was quiet, but decisive. Pragmatism split. One path led toward popularity and influence. The other led toward isolation and precision. Peirce remained on the second path, knowing it would be lonelier, and knowing that meaning, once loosened too far, never fully returns. For Charles Sanders Peirce, the most dangerous idea was not falsehood, it was ownership. He believed that truth could not belong to a single mind, a single institution, or a single generation. Any claim treated as final was already suspect. Knowledge, if it existed at all, existed only as a process extended across time. This conviction placed him at odds with nearly every intellectual structure around him. Philosophy had long been organized around authority. Confirm the thinker, confirm the system, confirm the doctrine. Science, too, increasingly rewarded decisive results and named discoveries. Credit mattered, priority mattered, ownership mattered. Peirce rejected this logic at its root. He argued that truth emerged only through what he called a community of inquiry. No individual, however brilliant, could secure truth alone. Beliefs had to be tested, criticized, revised, and retested by others, often across generations. Error was not an accident. It was a requirement. This made truth inherently impersonal. Peirce insisted that inquiry must remain open to future correction. A conclusion accepted today could be overturned tomorrow. What mattered was not certainty, but the direction of convergence over time. Truth was not a possession, it was a horizon. This view decentralized authority completely. No thinker could claim final say. No institution could freeze meaning. Even consensus was provisional. What appeared stable was only temporarily settled. The future always retained the right to disagree. For Peirce, this was not weakness. It was integrity. He understood that individuals are finite. They are shaped by context, bias, and limitation. A community, extended indefinitely, could correct for these distortions. Inquiry worked not because humans were reliable, but because they were corrigible. This required humility. Peirce was deeply suspicious of intellectual charisma. He distrusted systems built around personalities. He believed that when truth became associated with individuals, it hardened into dogma. Inquiry slowed. Criticism softened. Errors persisted longer than they should. Ownership corrupted inquiry. Instead, Peirce imagined knowledge as something that outlived its contributors. Ideas should be detachable from their creators. Arguments should survive without authority backing them. A claim should stand only insofar as it continued to withstand scrutiny. This vision had consequences. It offered no comfort to those seeking certainty. It provided no stable ground for ideology. It undermined the idea of intellectual mastery. It made philosophy an endless task rather than a completed structure. Many found this unsettling. Without final truths, how could decisions be made? Without authority, how could disagreement be resolved? Peirce's answer was unsatisfying to many. Decisions must be made provisionally. Disagreement must remain open. Stability was never guaranteed. Truth, in his framework, was not what individuals believed sincerely. It was what inquiry would eventually settle on, if pursued honestly, long enough, by enough minds. This placed truth permanently in the future. Peirce understood the psychological cost of this view. Humans want closure. They want answers that end debate. They want certainty that relieves responsibility. A truth without owners offers none of this. What it offers instead is discipline. Beliefs must remain accountable to experience. Interpretations must remain revisable. Authority must remain distributed. No voice, however persuasive, escapes correction. This made Peirce difficult to place politically and philosophically. He resisted relativism, but also rejected absolutism. He believed in objective truth, but denied that anyone could claim possession of it. Truth existed, but no one owned it. This idea quietly challenged every system built on control of meaning. Religious authority, academic hierarchy, ideological movements, all depended on stabilizing interpretation. Peirce's framework destabilized them from within, not by attack, by patience. Truth, he argued, could wait. Power could not. Institutions wanted resolution. Peirce insisted on process. Movements wanted unity. Peirce insisted on dissent. Leaders wanted followers. Peirce imagined participants. The community of inquiry had no center, no final arbiter, no permanent leader. Its strength lay in continuity rather than command. This vision partly explains why Peirce struggled professionally. His philosophy offered no shortcuts. It did not produce slogans. It did not mobilize crowds. It did not reward allegiance. It asked people to remain unfinished. Yet this is also why his ideas endured. In a world that repeatedly concentrates authority and then watches it fail, a model of truth without owners becomes quietly radical. It suggests that meaning does not need guardians. It needs conditions. Peirce did not promise certainty. He promised correction. Truth would emerge not through dominance but through persistence. Not through agreement, but through survival under critique. Not through ownership, but through time. This was his wager. And it remains one of the most unsettling ideas modern thought has produced. As Charles Sanders Peirce developed his philosophy, resistance did not come primarily from critics who misunderstood him. It came from systems that understood him all too well. His ideas threatened something foundational, not belief, but authority built on certainty. During Peirce's lifetime, positivism was gaining strength. It promised order, clarity, and control. Knowledge, positivists argued, should be grounded in observable facts, verified by standardized methods and expressed in clear, decisive language. What could not be measured accounted for nothing. What could not be settled was dismissed. This approach reassured institutions. Universities, laboratories, and governments favored frameworks that delivered stable results. Positivism offered confidence that knowledge could be finalized, cataloged, and deployed. It aligned neatly with bureaucracy. It rewarded closure. It minimized ambiguity. Peirce represented the opposite impulse. He argued that inquiry could never reach absolute certainty. Every conclusion remained provisional, open to future correction. Error was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. Fallibility was not a temporary inconvenience. It was permanent. This was deeply uncomfortable. Institutions relied on expertise to function. Expertise required authority. Authority required confidence. A philosophy that insisted on perpetual revisability threatened this chain at every link. If knowledge was never final, then expertise became conditional. Authority weakened. Certainty fought back. Peirce's insistence on fallibilism appeared destabilizing. Administrators worried that admitting uncertainty undermined trust. Scientists feared that emphasizing error invited skepticism. Philosophers accused him of eroding foundations rather than securing them. The reaction was not always explicit. It rarely took the form of direct refutation. Instead, Peirce's work was sidelined. His terminology was avoided. His conclusions were labeled impractical. His refusal to simplify was treated as a personal flaw. Positivism advanced because it promised resolution. Peirce stalled progress by insisting on conditions. This tension reflected a deeper conflict about what knowledge was for. Peirce treated it as a process. One aimed for usable answers. The other aimed for survivable beliefs. Institutions preferred the former. A belief that can be deployed quickly is valuable to systems. A belief that must remain open is difficult to manage. Peirce's philosophy offered no endpoint where inquiry could stop safely. It denied institutions the ability to declare completion. This denial provoked resistance. Certainty is comforting. It stabilizes hierarchies. It allows decisions to appear justified rather than provisional. Fallibility threatens this comfort. It introduces responsibility. If conclusions can be wrong, then those who enforce them remain accountable. Peirce understood this danger. He argued that clinging to certainty did not eliminate error. It concealed it. When institutions declared truths final, mistakes persisted longer. Correction slowed. Inquiry ossified. Confidence replaced curiosity. From Peirce's perspective, positivism traded honesty for efficiency. He did not reject empirical methods. He rejected the illusion that method alone could guarantee certainty. Observation knows only what it has already encountered. Interpretation mediates everything. Context intrudes. Bias persists. Fallibility remained unavoidable. It was institutional. Systems built on expertise could not tolerate perpetual revision without appearing weak. Authority required decisiveness, not hesitation. Peirce's philosophy made hesitation principled. This placed him outside the dominant intellectual current of his time. Positivism flourished because it aligned with administrative needs. Peirce's work languished because it complicated them. Yet the resistance revealed something important. Certainty did not fight back because Peirce was wrong. It fought back because he exposed its fragility. A system confident in its foundations does not fear revision. Only systems dependent on stability resist correction. Peirce saw this clearly. He believed that discomfort with fallibility was itself a symptom. It signaled fear of responsibility rather than commitment to truth. To admit uncertainty was not to abandon rigor. It was to accept the burden of inquiry fully. Certainty promised rest. Fallibilism demanded work. Institutions chose rest. Peirce chose work. And in doing so, he positioned his ideas outside the comfort of their time, where they would wait patiently, resisting closure, until the world was ready to confront uncertainty without demanding refuge. That moment would arrive much later. 11. A life that outran its audience. By the final decades of his life, Charles Sanders Peirce had effectively disappeared from public intellectual life. This disappearance was not dramatic. There was no scandal that forced him out, no decisive rejection. He simply faded from view as the world moved in directions his work could not easily follow. Peirce continued writing relentlessly. Manuscripts accumulated in enormous quantities. Notes, drafts, revisions, and fragments filled boxes and folders. Ideas were restated, refined, and redirected. Concepts evolved slowly, reshaped by new distinctions and corrections. He wrote not to publish quickly, but to think accurately. Most of this work remained unseen. Without institutional affiliation, Peirce lacked editors, advocates, and steady platforms. Journals favored concise conclusions. Publishers preferred coherent systems. Peirce produced neither. His thought unfolded across decades, resisting compression into finished doctrine. This placed him at a severe disadvantage. He lived in increasing isolation, both intellectual and material. Financial hardship was constant. He relied on occasional support from friends, including William James, who recognized the depth of his work even as the broader world ignored it. Peirce believed that inquiry was not bound to immediate reception. Truth did not depend on audience size. An idea could remain dormant, awaiting conditions that allowed it to be understood. He accepted obscurity as the cost of rigor. Still, The isolation weighed heavily. Peirce was aware that his ideas were advancing beyond the intellectual tools of his time. He introduced distinctions and methods that demanded patience and technical discipline. Without these, readers misunderstood him or abandoned the effort altogether. His work outran its audience. Philosophical culture increasingly favored clarity, certainty, and practical application. Peirce offered complexity, provisionality, and endless revision. He wrote for a future community of inquiry rather than a contemporary readership. This future did not arrive during his lifetime. As years passed, Peirce's name appeared less frequently. His influence survived indirectly, embedded within fields that did not always acknowledge him. Logic, semiotics, philosophy of science absorbed elements of his thinking without recognizing their source. Peirce observed this with mixed emotion. He did not crave fame, but he cared deeply about understanding. Misinterpretation troubled him more than neglect. Ideas detached from their conditions became distorted. Concepts stripped of process hardened into caricatures. He had written extensively about this danger. Now he lived it. Peirce's isolation was not the romantic solitude of a misunderstood genius. It was practical, exhausting, and often humiliating. He struggled to secure basic necessities. He worried about unfinished work. He revised endlessly, fearing that premature closure would betray the inquiry itself. Yet he did not abandon his principles. He continued refining his philosophy of signs, truth, and inquiry. He continued insisting that meaning was not fixed, that knowledge belonged to communities rather than individuals, and that certainty was always provisional. These commitments made his work difficult to inherit. Without clear entry points, later readers faced a mountain of text without guidance. Peirce left no single definitive book, no streamlined system, only a vast archive of thought in motion. This was intentional. Peirce believed that freezing inquiry into a final statement betrayed its nature. Understanding required continuity, not conclusion. His work was designed to be revisited, revised, and extended rather than mastered. The cost of this design was invisibility. By the time Peirce died in 1914, he was largely unknown outside small intellectual circles. His papers remained scattered, unpublished, and daunting. The world had not caught up. Yet the distance between Peirce and his audience was not permanent. His life had outrun his time, but not history. What appeared as failure during his lifetime became potential after it. The work waited, unfinished, unowned, and unresolved, precisely as he believed truth should. Peirce did not leave behind answers. He left behind conditions. And those conditions would eventually allow his ideas to emerge. Slowly, once the world learned to tolerate thinking that refused to stop. Charles Sanders Peirce did not plan for his ideas to survive him. He left no final book, no completed system, no definitive statement that could be passed intact from one generation to the next. What he left behind instead was an archive of work that resisted closure, scattered across manuscripts, drafts, revisions, and marginal notes. After his death in 1914, this incompleteness became a liability. Peirce's papers were difficult to access and even harder to interpret. Thousands of pages remained unpublished, disorganized, and technically demanding. There was no clear entry point for readers unfamiliar with his terminology or methods. In an intellectual culture that increasingly valued clarity and efficiency, Peirce appeared opaque and impractical. For several decades, his work was largely ignored. Philosophy moved toward systems that promised certainty. Logical positivism offered strict criteria for meaning. Analytic philosophy refined language into formal structures. Psychology and linguistics professionalized rapidly, favoring measurable results over speculative inquiry. Peirce's unfinished manuscripts did not fit easily into any of these movements. Yet the problems Peirce had identified did not disappear. As the 20th century progressed, confidence in final explanations began to erode. Language proved less stable than expected, meaning shifted with context. Observation influenced outcomes. Scientific theories required continual revision. Certainty, once treated as attainable, became increasingly fragile. Philosophy began encountering the limits Peirce had anticipated. Scholars returned to his work not because it offered solutions, but because it described the problem accurately. His theory of signs explained why meaning could not be fixed. Signs referred to other signs, not directly to objects. Interpretation did not end. It unfolded across time, shaped by context and use. Semiotics emerged as a field concerned with how meaning is generated, transmitted, and transformed. Linguistics, anthropology, and media studies found in Peirce a framework that matched their observations. Meaning was not contained in symbols alone. It arose through interpretation. Peirce's philosophy of inquiry also found renewed relevance. His insistence on fallibilism aligned with scientific practice that increasingly emphasized uncertainty, probability, and correction. Knowledge advanced not through certainty, but through error, managed over time. His concept of a community of inquiry resonated with collaborative models of research and distributed knowledge. What once appeared impractical now appeared accurate. Editors began the long process of organizing his papers. Scholars reconstructed arguments from fragments. Interpretations varied, often conflicting with one another. This was not a failure of the work. It reflected its nature. Peirce had never intended his ideas to settle into a single authoritative reading. Multiplicity was built in. No school claimed him fully. No doctrine stabilized around his name. His influence spread across disciplines, shaping questions rather than supplying answers. Logic, philosophy of science, semiotics, and communication theory absorbed elements of his thinking without requiring allegiance to a system. This diffusion preserved his work. Peirce's unfinished philosophy proved adaptable in ways finished systems could not. It did not collapse when assumptions changed. It did not require defense against revision. Its openness allowed it to survive intellectual shifts that dismantled more rigid frameworks. His ideas did not return as prophecy. They returned as tools. They helped thinkers understand why meaning drifted, why interpretation multiplied, and why certainty repeatedly failed. Peirce did not explain the future of thought. He explained why thought could not stop evolving. This delayed recognition revealed something essential about his work. Peirce had written for a future audience that did not yet exist. His philosophy required a culture willing to tolerate uncertainty without demanding immediate resolution. Once such a culture emerged, his ideas found relevance. The afterlife of his work was not a revival. It was an arrival. Peirce's refusal to finalize meaning became his greatest strength. His unfinished manuscripts invited participation rather than obedience. Readers did not inherit conclusions. They inherited responsibility. Understanding Peirce required continuing the inquiry. This is why his philosophy endured. Finished systems age quickly. Unfinished processes adapt. Peirce left behind a method that could absorb new conditions without collapsing. Even now, his ideas resist closure. Each time certainty breaks down, his work reappears. Not to restore confidence, but to explain why confidence was never secure to begin with. Peirce never completed his philosophy. As Charles Sanders Peirce's ideas began to circulate more widely, a familiar accusation followed. Critics claimed that his philosophy undermined truth itself. By rejecting certainty, by insisting that all knowledge was provisional, Peirce appeared to open the door to relativism. If beliefs were always revisable, critics asked, what prevented anything from being true? Peirce understood this fear. It emerged whenever authority weakened, whenever foundations cracked, whenever truth stopped behaving like property. To many readers, fallibilism sounded like surrender. If no belief was final, then all beliefs seemed equally unstable. Truth, for Peirce, was not a matter of opinion, preference, or convenience. Truth existed. What he denied was ownership. Peirce distinguished carefully between what individuals believe and what inquiry could eventually establish. A belief could be wrong even if widely accepted. Consensus did not guarantee truth, nor did conviction. Truth was not what people happened to agree on at a given moment. It was what inquiry would converge upon over time. This distinction mattered. Relativism collapses truth into perspective. Peirce refused this collapse. He believed that reality constrained interpretation. Signs pointed outward. Experience resisted wishful thinking. Error could persist, but it could also be corrected. Fallibilism did not deny truth. It denied final access to it. Peirce argued that treating beliefs as absolute froze inquiry prematurely. Once a belief was declared immune to revision, criticism softened. Doubt became taboo. Errors entrenched themselves behind authority. This, he believed, was the real threat to truth. Certainty created the illusion of stability while allowing mistakes to endure unchecked. Institutions defended conclusions long after evidence shifted. Dogma replaced inquiry. Correction slowed. From Peirce's perspective, relativism was not the danger. Finality was. He believed that acknowledging fallibility strengthened truth rather than weakening it. A belief open to correction could adapt. A belief declared final could only be defended. This placed him at odds with both absolutists and relativists. Absolutists wanted certainty. Relativists abandoned constraint. Peirce rejected both positions. He insisted on constraint without certainty. Reality pushed back against interpretation, but interpretation never stopped. Truth, in his framework, was neither arbitrary nor possessed. It was approached asymptotically. This view required patience. Critics often ignored this patience. They accused Peirce of dissolving standards. They claimed his philosophy left no ground for judgment. If beliefs were provisional, how could decisions be made? How could error be condemned? Peirce answered plainly. Decisions must be made provisionally. Error must be corrected when discovered. Judgment did not require certainty. It required accountability. Beliefs had to answer to experience and to future inquiry. Responsibility replaced authority. This shift was unsettling. Many preferred systems where truth arrived fully formed, where doctrine settled disputes, where uncertainty could be dismissed. Peirce offered no such comfort. His philosophy demanded ongoing participation. To some, this felt like erosion. They mistook openness for weakness. They mistook revision for indecision. They mistook humility for surrender. Peirce anticipated this reaction. He wrote extensively about the human desire for certainty. He understood that insecurity drives people toward fixed beliefs, but he believed this desire distorted inquiry. Comfort replaced accuracy. Stability replaced honesty. Truth suffered. Peirce's position was demanding. It asked thinkers to live without guarantees, to accept that beliefs might fail, to remain committed to inquiry even when conclusions dissolved. Relativism abandons the idea of correction. Peirce centered it. He believed that inquiry, if pursued honestly and collectively, would move toward truth over time. Not perfectly, not quickly, but reliably enough to justify the effort. Truth, then, was not destroyed. It was delayed. Critics accused Peirce of undermining certainty because they equated certainty with truth. Peirce separated them. Certainty was psychological. Truth was methodological. One belonged to individuals, the other belonged to inquiry. This distinction remains difficult to accept. Even today, Peirce's philosophy is misread as skepticism or relativism. Yet his work stands as one of the strongest defenses of objective truth without dogma. He did not weaken truth. He removed its false guardians, and in doing so, he left truth exposed, demanding, and alive. Charles Sanders Peirce did not write about computers, algorithms, or artificial intelligence. Yet much of the modern world now operates according to structures he described with unsettling precision. Long before machines process symbols at scale, Peirce explained how meaning emerges through interpretation rather than storage. This distinction matters. Machines do not understand meaning. They manipulate signs. They process inputs, transform them according to rules, and generate outputs that resemble understanding. What appears intelligent is, in fact, inferential structure operating without awareness. Peirce would have recognized this immediately. His theory of signs was not concerned with symbols alone. A sign, for Peirce, was anything that stood for something else to an interpreter. Meaning did not reside in the sign itself. It emerged through interpretation, which depended on context, habit, and expectation. Modern algorithms operate on representations that point to other representations. Data becomes signal. Signal becomes inference. Inference becomes action. At no point does meaning stabilize. It moves through layers of interpretation without arriving at final understanding. This is Peircean. Artificial intelligence systems rely heavily on abduction, the inferential process Peirce described as reasoning from effects to possible causes. When a model predicts outcomes based on incomplete information, it is abducting. It is proposing plausible explanations rather than deducing certainty. Peirce identified abduction as the engine of discovery. It was the weakest form of inference, yet the most creative. It generated hypotheses that could later be tested. Abduction did not guarantee truth. It enabled inquiry to move forward under uncertainty. Modern machine learning operates similarly. Models infer patterns from data without knowing why those patterns exist. They adjust probabilities. They revise outputs. They improve through correction rather than certainty. Error is not eliminated. It is minimized iteratively. This mirrors Peirce's view of knowledge. Truth, in this framework, is not a fixed target. It is approached through repeated correction. Systems improve not by achieving certainty, but by reducing error over time. Peirce anticipated this logic. He rejected the idea that knowledge could be finalized. Instead, he emphasized convergence. Inquiry moved toward stability without ever fully arriving. This is precisely how modern systems function. They approximate solutions without claiming completion. Yet there is a critical difference. Machines do not participate in a community of inquiry. They do not care about truth. They optimize objectives defined by humans. Their outputs reflect goals, constraints, and biases embedded in their design. Meaning remains external. This exposes a tension Peirce understood deeply. Interpretation requires responsibility. Signs influence behavior. When interpretation is automated, accountability diffuses. Decisions appear objective while remaining shaped by invisible assumptions. Peirce warned against this illusion. He insisted that inquiry required transparency, correction, and communal oversight. Without these, systems hardened into authority. Error persisted behind complexity. Confidence replaced scrutiny. Modern algorithmic systems risk precisely this outcome. As machines mediate information, meaning becomes procedural. Outputs gain authority through repetition. Predictions shape behavior. Feedback loops reinforce themselves. What begins as inference solidifies into expectation. Peirce's philosophy offers a way to see this clearly. He reminds us that interpretation never ends. Outputs must remain revisable. Systems must remain corrigible. Authority must remain distributed. Without these safeguards, inference becomes dogma. This is not a technical problem. It is a philosophical one. Artificial intelligence does not threaten meaning by replacing humans. It threatens meaning by concealing interpretation. When decisions appear automatic, responsibility dissolves. Peirce understood that truth required visible inquiry. His emphasis on fallibilism becomes urgent here. Models fail. Data shifts. Context changes. Treating algorithmic outputs as final truths reproduces the same error. Peirce opposed in philosophy. Certainty freezes inquiry. Correction slows. Mistakes persist longer than they should. Peirce's work insists on humility. Even highly advanced systems operate under conditions of uncertainty. Their success depends on continuous revision. Treating them as authoritative undermines their reliability. Trust must be provisional, not absolute. This insight is increasingly relevant. As societies delegate interpretation to machines, Peirce's ideas reappear embedded within the systems themselves. Abduction drives discovery. Fallibilism governs revision. Semiotics explains drift. Community oversight remains necessary. Peirce did not design algorithms. He described their logic. Meaning, in the age of machines, remains unstable. Signs circulate faster. Interpretation accelerates. Feedback loops compress time. Yet the structure remains familiar. Meaning emerges through use, context, and correction. Peirce helps us see what machines cannot. They process signs. Humans assign meaning. Inquiry requires responsibility. Truth requires openness. Without these, systems become opaque and unaccountable. Peirce's philosophy does not resist technology. It contextualizes it. He reminds us that no system escapes interpretation. No output escapes context. No inference escapes correction. Meaning remains a process, not a product. In a world increasingly shaped by machines, this reminder matters. Peirce's ideas endure not because they predict technology, but because they explain how meaning survives it. Charles Sanders Peirce spent his life explaining a problem that never went away. Meaning, he argued, does not arrive whole. It unfolds. It shifts. It resists final settlement not because humans fail to grasp it, but because meaning itself is not the kind of thing that can be closed. This unsettledness was not a temporary condition. It was structural. Peirce believed that meaning emerged through interpretation, and interpretation depended on context, habit, and consequence. A sign did not carry meaning inside itself. It acquired meaning through use, through response, through what it led interpreters to expect and do next. This process never stopped. Each interpretation generated further interpretations. Each clarification introduced new distinctions. Meaning advanced, not toward final definition, but toward increased articulation. What appeared settled was simply what had not yet been questioned. This is why meaning never stabilized. Human beings repeatedly attempted to arrest this movement. They built systems, doctrines, and institutions designed to freeze interpretation. Definitions were formalized. Authorities were established. Closure was declared. Yet each attempt eventually failed. Context shifted. Circumstances changed. New experiences disrupted old frameworks. Meaning resumed its movement. Peirce saw this recurrence everywhere. Scientific theories advanced, then fractured. Moral systems hardened, then eroded. Languages evolved, shedding old associations and acquiring new ones. Even the most rigorous formal systems required revision as their limits became visible. Unfinishedness was not a defect. It was a condition of survival. Peirce argued that inquiry remained alive only as long as it tolerated its own incompleteness. This tolerance was difficult. Humans crave certainty. They want meanings that end anxiety. They seek definitions that relieve responsibility. Unfinished meaning feels uncomfortable because it demands participation. It requires ongoing judgment rather than obedience. Yet Peirce insisted that this discomfort was necessary. Meaning that settles completely stops responding to reality. It no longer answers to experience. Correction becomes impossible. Error persists longer. Inquiry hardens into dogma. Peirce did not celebrate instability for its own sake. He believed in truth. He believed that inquiry converged over time. But convergence was not closure. It was direction. Meaning moved toward greater coherence without ever exhausting interpretation. This distinction mattered. Meaning did not wander aimlessly. It was constrained by reality, experience, and consequence. Interpretations that failed repeatedly were abandoned. Habits adjusted. Inquiry corrected itself. Yet no point along this path could claim final authority. Each generation inherited meanings shaped by the past and reshaped them under new pressures. This inheritance was never neutral. It carried assumptions, blind spots, and omissions. Meaning evolved as these were exposed. Peirce understood that this process would never conclude. He wrote for a future that would continue interpreting him. He accepted that his ideas would be misunderstood, revised, and repurposed. This did not disturb him. It confirmed his philosophy. Meaning survived by refusing ownership. No individual could possess it. No institution could freeze it. No era could complete it. Meaning belonged to the ongoing interaction between signs, interpreters, and reality. This is why meaning still has not settled. Modern systems attempt to stabilize it through data, algorithms, and automation. Patterns are extracted. Predictions are generated. Yet interpretation remains necessary. Context intrudes. Values shape outcomes. Responsibility cannot be eliminated. Machines accelerate inference, but they do not end interpretation. Scientific models improve accuracy, but they remain provisional. Cultural narratives circulate faster, but they fracture more easily. Information multiplies, but understanding lags behind. The same pattern repeats. meaning advances, meaning fractures, meaning reforms. Peirce's philosophy does not resolve this cycle. It explains it. He showed that meaning is not a destination. It is a process embedded in time. It requires correction. It demands patience. It resists final settlement because reality continues to surprise us. This is not a failure of thought. It is its condition. Meaning has not settled because inquiry has not ended. History continues. Context shifts. New experiences demand reinterpretation. Each attempt to freeze meaning creates the conditions for its eventual revision. Peirce did not promise answers that would last forever. He offered a way to live with questions that persist. Meaning remains unfinished because the world remains unfinished. And as long as inquiry continues, meaning will move, revise itself, and refuse to settle. That refusal is not a weakness. It is how meaning survives. Charles Sanders Peirce believed that chance was not a flaw in reality, but a condition of its creativity. Where others sought necessity, he allowed for spontaneity. Where systems demanded closure, he left space for surprise. The future, in his view, was not something waiting to be discovered. It was something still coming into being. This belief shaped everything. Peirce argued that novelty was real. New forms, new meanings, new habits could emerge that were not fully determined by the past. This did not mean chaos ruled. Patterns constrained possibility. Habits guided behavior. Laws stabilized experience. But none of these eliminated the appearance of something genuinely new. Chance mattered. Without it, inquiry would stagnate. If everything were predetermined, discovery would be illusion. Learning would reduce to recollection. Meaning would be repetition disguised as progress. Peirce rejected this world. He insisted that the universe was unfinished. This unfinishedness made inquiry possible. It allowed beliefs to evolve. It made correction meaningful. It ensured that truth, while constrained, was never exhausted. The future remained open not because it was unknowable, but because it was not yet fully formed. This openness haunted his work. Peirce did not haunt the future by predicting it. He haunted it by refusing to close it. His ideas lingered wherever certainty failed, wherever systems overreached, wherever confidence collapsed under complexity. The haunting was quiet. It appeared when definitions frayed, when interpretation multiplied, when authority lost its grip. In those moments, Peirce's insistence on fallibility returned, not as doctrine, but as orientation. He offered no refuge, only responsibility. To live in an open future required humility. It required patience with uncertainty. It demanded participation rather than obedience. Peirce believed that meaning survived only when people remained willing to revise what they thought they knew. This willingness was rare. Most systems preferred stability. They sought to end debate, not sustain it. They treated uncertainty as failure. Peirce treated it as necessity. Without uncertainty, inquiry collapsed into administration. Chance protected inquiry. It prevented meaning from hardening too quickly. It allowed novelty to enter. It ensured that interpretation remained responsive to experience rather than insulated from it. Peirce's life embodied this tension. His work never settled. His recognition arrived late. His ideas circulated without him. Yet they endured precisely because they refused finality. He did not build monuments. He left traces. Traces that reappeared when certainty proved brittle. Traces that resurfaced when systems failed to explain themselves. Traces that reminded thinkers that meaning did not belong to anyone, and the future belonged to no plan. The haunting continues. Each generation confronts moments when explanation fails, when models fracture, when predictions falter. In those moments, Peirce's philosophy becomes visible again, not as answer, but as permission to continue asking. The future remains open, not because it is mysterious, but because it is unfinished. Chance has not been eliminated. Novelty has not been exhausted. Meaning has not settled. Peirce understood this early. He accepted that inquiry would never conclude. That truth would never be owned. That certainty would always provoke its own undoing. He believed this was not tragic. It was hopeful. An open future meant correction remained possible. Error was not permanent. Meaning could change. Understanding could deepen. The world was not trapped inside its past. Peirce did not promise clarity, he offered endurance. And that is why his ideas remain quietly, persistently, haunting the edges of certainty, where meaning is still becoming.